to Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that strengthens communities by helping Oklahomans learn about the human experience, understand new perspectives, and participate knowledgeably in civic life. You can check out all of our programs at our newly redesigned website, okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll, a program officer at Oklahoma Humanities. In this episode, we're going to be talking about memorials and monuments and the meanings they convey. Our guest is Dr. Nathan Shank, an assistant professor at Oklahoma Christian University, where he teaches composition and directs the Writing Center. He received his PhD in English from the University of Kentucky in 2015 and his master's in English from the University of Oklahoma in 2011. He's recently published in the field of technical writing, and he's working on a research project about monument memorials. Nathan's wife, Manda, works as a program associate for the Kirkpatrick Foundation, and they have two children, Hannah, age 5, and Amos, age 2. And Dr. Shank gave a great presentation at the Oklahoma Humanities Curiosity Fest in 2019 about memorials as sites of trauma and healing. And we're really glad to have him on the podcast to talk about this topic. So welcome, Nathan.
Great. Thanks to be here.
Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here.
I wanted to start by asking you, how did you become interested in thinking about and studying monuments and memorials in the first place?
Well, there's probably a few events. One, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and they put in this new bubble-looking public library when I was growing up, and I remember there was a bunch of kind of civic criticism of it. But one of the criticisms was they had all these quotes, like in front of the library on different statues and rocks and stuff, and one of them was by Karl Marx, Workers of the World Unite. And everyone was very critical of using Marx, even though the message actually kind of fit pretty well.
Wow.
But really, I owe it to Dan Cottam at the University of Oklahoma, who I took for a course on violence and literature. And he opened the whole course talking about the Kent State shooting and the memorials that were used to represent that. And that's something I'd love to talk about at some point today.
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah. Well, let's talk about that. What is the memorial at Kent State?
So in 1970, the Kent State shooting happened. It was in the midst of debates about freedom of speech. And so they...
it was a Vietnam War
during
protest.
the Vietnam War, right. And protesting that. And so events got out of hand, and 4 students were killed during the police attack on them. And so there were several memorial designs kind of initially posed for, okay, how are we going to represent these deaths, especially they're so nationally significant. And the first design was one that represents the binding of Isaac from Genesis, except it's kind of a modern rendition. And it's Abraham, and he's dressed as a farmer, and he's holding the shoulder of his son Isaac, and he's got a knife in his hand, right? And so he's taking Isaac up to Mount Moriah essentially to kill him, like God told him to. One of the most challenging passages in the Bible. So you can imagine the reaction of the administration when this design was posed. They had hired the sculptor to represent it, and he basically is condemning them, basically indicting them. Right?
Like, you've sacrificed your children here?
Right,
basically?
yeah, you've sacrificed your children, and the government has allowed it, right? The government as God, or the police as God, right? Saying, yeah, go do this. This is sanctioned. So that memorial, which you can find at Princeton University, was not chosen. Oh. And instead, if you go there, you can see this placid scene. There's 4 circular stones, and there's flowers, and there's notes of remembrance and such. But it's very nonviolent and very non-controversial. So that just fascinated me, and I can't get out of my head.
Wow, interesting. I actually just saw a documentary about David Crosby, who was in the band Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and they wrote the song Ohio about that incident. And he visited the monument at Kent State, and he was pointing out, he has an encyclopedic knowledge of that incident. He was pointing out, he knew the names of the shooters, even, of the National Guardsmen, and of course the names of the people who died. It's really a powerful moment in that documentary. But anyway, were you also involved in a local memorial advisory task force?
Yes, I was part of a Veterans Memorial Task Force commissioned by the city of Edmond and the late Mayor Lamb. And Stevenson Park in Edmond is kind of one of the central parks closest downtown. And there, it's commissioned to be overhauled. They're redoing that whole area right now. And so part of that park is a war memorial, Veterans War Memorial. And it's of this man, and he's holding a hammer in his arm, and he's about to hit an anvil, and he's got a sword on the anvil. And the quote is, they will turn their swords into plowshares, right? And so it's a war memorial, but it's one to peace. Anyway, they decided that the pavers had gotten ruined over time, where people had their names, and eventually they wanted a new memorial for Edmund, and so they were going to move that one elsewhere, but they wanted a new representation for veterans to come. And so this task force, we pretty much had free reign to decide where it would go, as long as it was on public land, and what it would look like. And so I didn't really do much. I attended a lot of the meetings. I didn't say much, but it was fascinating to watch civic discourse actually work. And see all these veterans who cared about it and cared about where they could go to mourn and remember, decide how that would actually happen. And then we had a graphic designer come in, and he was able to produce some architectural drawings. Anyway, it's on the list to be developed now in another park in Edmond. There's going to be a path that goes down, and you kind of go into this site where it's quiet, and there are names, and there are places to remember and grieve there. So.
Oh, interesting. Well, I might ask you some more about that later on in the episode, but I know in your presentation at our Curiosity Fest, you mentioned a scholar of memorials named Del Upton, and he pointed out that there have been two great monumentalizing periods, he called them. So I guess time periods when people were interested in thinking and talking and building about and building memorials. And that was the first great period was from the 1880s to the 1930s. And the second great period of monumentalizing was the 1980s to the present.
Yes, that's right.
Why were people in these time periods especially concerned with building memorials and monuments, do you think?
Well, Upton's point is that during Reconstruction, essentially in the first period, people are, the nation has been torn apart by the Civil War, and so they're trying to reclaim those values that may have been disrupted. And so that's why we see a lot of the Confederate War memorials were created during that time, the ones that are so controversial right now and being torn down. And so Upton's point is that the confidence of these memorials, the fact that they're long-lasting and enduring, kind of belies the insecurity that surrounded the erecting of them, essentially. Recently, I think it's probably more debatable about why we are so obsessed with memorials and remembrance, whether it's because of the changing culture that, some credit to the 70s and 80s, or whether it's the way politics and wars are playing out now. And, we don't have world wars, but we have all these current conflicts and military installations. That might be a possibility.
I thought it was interesting that these two time periods that he talks about are both 20 years or starting about 20 years after a lot of dramatic incidents that happened in the 1860s and the 1960s. So maybe it takes a generation removed from that to start thinking about the broader meanings or how to memorialize those kinds of conflicts.
I wish it were so simple. I mean, my tendency is to completely agree with you and say, historical memory does kind of start later. But at the same time, people are also very quick to want to memorialize. It was only less than a year after the end of World War II that the first memorial was built in Berlin.
Oh, wow.
Which to me is just striking and almost terrifying. You kind of feel like that's not enough time, right?
Yeah.
Like we can't know even what we should be thinking yet.
What's that memorial like? Do you know anything about it?
That one's not coming to my mind right now. I think it's fairly simple.
Okay. So I really wanted to ask, I was really looking forward to asking you this question. What are some elements that make an effective memorial? And maybe later on we can talk about what makes a not great memorial.
So there could be some physical design specifications that I think could be effective, but I'm more interested in maybe, how the abstract qualities go about it. So you definitely want to have some kind of public debate about the memorial, right? There needs to be different views involved, but that also needs to at some point be limited. And so that the controversy itself doesn't almost ruin the memorial. Because sometimes you'll see memorials become very flat and almost toothless when every group has to compromise. And of course, if I say certain memorials here, I'm kind of critiquing them, I guess. But a lot of people say that the World War II memorial in D.C., which has only come very recently, it's fine. It represents a lot of different perspectives, but it doesn't really strike you, right? But on the other hand, if you can integrate different views effectively into the design of the memorial, make space for conflicting narratives or conflicting perspectives, then that to me would be a huge success. And few memorials really are able to do this. Usually the memorials tend to be pretty one-sided. for the victors, as they say, and other perspectives that don't have enough political clout tend to be left out. I think The Guardian in Oklahoma, atop our state's capital, does a pretty good job of trying to cover a lot of different perspectives. So even though, it's a Native American standing there, the idea is that it represents all people who have suffered in Oklahoma. And that's kind of the narrative that I have heard, speeches from senators, et cetera, surrounding that particular memorial, expressing is that it's not just about the Trail of Tears. It's also about the Dust Bowl. It's also about, current people who are suffering in Oklahoma for various reasons. So there's kind of a success in the ambiguity there. Even though it's Native American, it still stands for all Oklahomans.
Yeah, I think we've all gone past memorials many times and not even thought about them because, as you described, they're just kind of toothless and a boring image or nothing that has a deeper meaning to it.
They're definitely all over. And that's maybe something that a successful memorial would do, is it prevents you from just going by it and ignoring it. I'd hate to say all memorials have to do that, but certainly ones which strike us, make us remember, but also try to teach us something. And there's a lot of scholarly debate about it's called the tutelary role of the memorial. Should it try to teach us lessons based on events, or is that too much? Is that too didactic and kind of not the role of memorials? Maybe let history books do that. Let preachers or whoever wants to create our country's morals, let them do that, but let the memorials just remember. And so, I don't know. I think it's not bad if we're trying to prevent future tragedies from happening. Maybe these memorials can help do that by reminding people how they came about in the first place.
You've written and spoken about how memorials can be sites of public conflict and contradiction, and how it's difficult for memorials to represent multiple perspectives on a subject. Can you talk a little bit more about that idea?
Yeah. So a lot of memorials really struggle to give perpetrators any voice, or people who are not the ones most directly impacted by a memorial. So war memorials tend to be the most common kind. There's one called Lest We Forget in Addington, Oklahoma, and it's a particularly egregious example of one which really doesn't allow for other voices. So you go to it, and the first thing you notice is all this weaponry that's there. Rockets, and there's just everything is kind of designed in the shape of modern warfare. And even the podium on which there's a plaque, it's a torpedo, right? Huh. And then they've just put the plaque on top of it. And there's all these, there's several other plaques, and they all tell stories of heroics, right? So there's no account of who they were fighting, who they killed, how that might be a problem, the politics of war. Really the only other voice we get, or maybe two other voices, we get some corporate sponsorship. There's very prominent sponsors there, and you got to pay for it. How prominent corporate sponsors should be, I think, is certainly something we should think about as far as kind of interfering with sites of remembrance. But and then there's also a lot of religious language in those plaques, and so there seems to be kind of a unidirectional way that those memorials are composed. And we see this with a lot of war memorials. And they tend to be good sites for veterans to come and grieve, but non-combatants, other people associated with the events, not much place for them there.
I heard you give some examples about the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is adjacent to the National Mall. Can you talk about how different perspectives on King were involved in the planning of that memorial and some of the controversies after it was unveiled? Yeah,
so it's a pretty dicey one. It's another one of those where public controversy kind of got out of hand. So if you Google the images of the memorial, it's of King, and he's got a stern expression on his face. And whether that means he's, stern because he's got this, righteous justice about him, and he's angry and he's ready to, clear the tables, and, he's fighting for civil rights, or whether you see him as, maybe too far that way. Maybe he's upset, he's violent, he's angry. A lot of people didn't think that was the right countenance for him to have.
To represent someone who advocated for nonviolence.
Exactly. Okay. Kind of maybe a little ironic there. And then, like you said, the creating of it itself. So it was composed in this white marble from China. And a lot of people found it's like the whitest marble you can find to be almost painfully ironic to represent a black person, right? Like, why would you choose, the most white marble? Why not find, something that maybe fits a little better? There's debates about that. And then the sculptor was, I believe, of Chinese heritage. And so there was debate about that. To me, the biggest problem of it was how much King's Trust charged to use his words and image, which essentially furthers his legacy. They charged $800,000 for that. And that's, essentially public and corporate sponsor money that went to pay for that. So, yeah, a lot of controversy that kind of still leaves a bad taste in your mouth if you know it, when you go see that memorial.
We'll put some images of the memorials that we'll discuss on the webpage for this episode, too. So we have some great pictures of that one to show. I know in your presentation you mentioned that scholars of memorials often say it's amazing that any memorials ever get constructed because of the process it takes to debate them and come up with a design. But you've also said that it can be a great example of the democratic process at work. Are there any examples that come to mind about?
Yeah, definitely. And this is one reason I became so interested in them, to follow up with that earlier question, because Oklahoma has become this national trophy for the right way to create monuments, and specifically the bombing memorial in downtown Oklahoma City. Fairly minimal controversy surrounding its construction. It uses kind of a modern design that's somewhat symbolic, right? It has the seats, but it's not overly symbolic. It's not using, Grecian motifs to represent certain ideals, right? So it's very current, tapping into some of that abstraction that the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, My Lin's design, is known for kind of giving us in the current age. So Oklahoma and that particular memorial are very successful in terms of, allowing for that controversy to be part of the memorial, but not erasing it as well. And I think there was something else to your question that I've left out.
Oh, about the process of, like, the ability of public discourse to kind of overcome conflict when planning and designing a memorial.
Yeah. It's important to think about who gets to speak in these conversations and how the conversations turn into a design itself that is finally, composed and constructed. And a lot of times, these cities will ask for volunteers who would like to serve on this particular memorial committee, who would like to submit designs. And so there is kind of a democratic attempt at it usually, but that doesn't always mean that a lot of voices are heard. So that can be problematic as well.
What's the role of the artist in this process, or the designer of a memorial? Are there some controversies often that leak into the artist's work itself, or how the themes are communicated to the artist?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it seems like the artist has a lot of say in how he or she portrays the images, and sometimes they have rightfully a lot of control over it. They'll get to choose everything about it, the materials and the images, but we see the need to revise after that. A lot of times the memorials won't remain as they are. They'll be, something will be etched into them. It'll be, added in, or they'll be modified. Again, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, eventually they do have a figural representation of soldiers next to it, right? Because so many veterans were upset with the design. And so, Maya Lin chose the design, her submission won, right? And they implemented it, but that didn't mean that was the end of the story. Which similarly with the 9/11 memorial, we kind of see that extreme level of controversy, this massive public debate over it. And then finally, a design is chosen, but is everyone happy? No. But yeah, they do still happen, right? Because people need to remember and need to put their thoughts somewhere.
And you've studied and thought a lot about how memorials intentionally evoke certain emotions in people who view them. Can you talk about the role of emotions in memorials and the role of the viewer also?
Yes. So I see this as a central purpose, if not the central purpose of memorials, is to evoke emotions in a viewer. And we might think of the word empathy here. So the roots of the word empathy go back to viewing artistic works. And the idea was that when you feel empathy, you are actually kind of your thoughts and what you're looking at in the art are kind of the same. There's a oneness to that, a unity to it. And so that's really interesting in how we think about emotions and what kinds of emotions we are intended to feel, or the designer wants us to feel, or we're allowed to feel, or we bring to the memorial. So Erica Doss has this fantastic book called Memorial Mania, where she categorizes memorials not by time period or by style, so much as by emotions that they evoke. And so I think she has 5: anger, shame, grief, and sorrow are the main ones that she goes over. And I think there's one more that she adds on. And so this was kind of revolutionary for me, because we tend to think, oh, there's all these memorials and they make us feel sad, right? Or there's these monuments and they kind of make us feel happy, right? Or remember things in a good light. But to go to a memorial and feel shame is something entirely different, but equally powerful, I think.
Maybe a good example of that is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, which memorializes the lynchings and racial terror throughout the country.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a fantastic memorial, and it was just produced by the Equal Justice Initiative, led by Brian Stevenson. And the centerpiece of the memorial is you go into this, it's essentially a tomb, and you look up, and there are all these metal hanging bars right in front of you. And they have names written on them, and they represent all the people lynched during the Jim Crow era. And it's overwhelming because it surrounds you, and it's symbolic, but it's not, again, confusingly symbolic. And also it kind of exceeds the senses. So some memorials will use size as a way to kind of break us out of our normal way of thinking about things, right? So, and even traditionally, right, the Greek and Roman, designs, Athena was gigantic, right?
Like the Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial.
Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial, right? They tried to do this with Washington initially. And so, these designs kind of make us see things in a higher light and perceive them as gods. And I think that's true now, but more with abstractions, right? Or more with emotion. So, we go to the Memorial for Peace and Justice, and we are overwhelmed by guilt, but a good kind of guilt, right? A guilt that changes us and makes us better people, and sorrow and other emotions as well.
And there are statues of enslaved people there, I think, too, right, that are very powerful. And in addition to the kind of more abstract elements, there are some...
Yeah, I mean, they're like nearly graphic. They're images of slavery in the act. And again, we don't want to forget that, right? Simply representing these kind of abstract elements of it, thinking about lynching. Well, what exactly is that? Okay, well, here's how bad it was. We've kind of put that in figures that you can look at and imagine.
How about the memorial in Edmond at the Edmond Post Office that memorializes the shooting that happened there in the 1980s? How is emotion used in that kind of unusual monument?
Yeah, this is one of my favorites. I get to actually take my students to go see it occasionally. So, in 1986, there was the Edmond postal shooting, and I think a lot of your viewers will probably remember or know that story, right, where a disgruntled postal worker went in and basically went on a shooting rampage. And so the memorial is right next to the Edmond Post Office, and there's 14 fountains, which represent the 14 victims, and then there's a pedestal, and there are 2 figures on that pedestal, a man and a woman. And they're dressed in period clothes of, the 80s, and they're holding the yellow ribbon, right? That represents empathy and, kind of wartime tragedy and remembrance. And it's interesting that if you look right at them, the yellow ribbon is coming toward you. And so it's clearly the center of it. And the memorial is actually called not the Postal Mass Shooting Memorial, but the Yellow Ribbon Memorial.
Oh.
And so everything about the memorial makes you feel peace and makes you forget the tragedy. So there's no images of violence. There's no references to violence, except for, I think there's a brief description of what happened. But the majority of the memorial is making the viewer feel calm. And the images themselves, the 2 figures there, they can kind of be anyone, right? Man and a woman representing both genders. And so you kind of feel like you can be those people, and you can be the one holding the yellow ribbon and kind of getting through your grief, expressing your grief. And so it's kind of a deferral of the event itself. But I think it's been very successful. They just celebrated 33 years, or not celebrated, but remembered 33 years. And there's still people who go to that memorial to remember.
But some people have had an issue with that memorial, right? That they don't feel like it represents the tragedy clearly enough, or
Yeah, so I was talking to my mom the other day, and she's lived in Edmond for a while, and she didn't know it existed. And that's not against her. It's just, it's very plain. It doesn't pop out at you. It's there, and we just get used to kind of filtering out some of these things.
Sure.
And so I think, if my attention hadn't been drawn to it, I wouldn't know it either. And I think that's okay. Not all memorials should attain this grand status and this provoking imagery, like the Iwo Jima Memorial or something like that, where there's a lot of debate surrounding it. Some just need to be places where people who are familiar with that tragedy can go and can kind of be in the quiet and can, have a place to think about that tragedy.
And if it happens to draw you in and you want to search more, the meaning is in there.
Right.
Can find
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Another aspect of memorials that you've studied that I think is so interesting is their relationship with time. Because I guess, in a sense, memorials are literally carving something in stone. It should be permanent.
Right.
But it's actually a little more complicated than that, I think, right?
Right. So on the one hand, they seem to be, permanent representations of events, right? And so the way they're constructed can't really change. But we do see over time how people both change them physically and also interpret them in new ways. So interpret them in new ways, right? So the Confederate memorials that are being torn down across the country, these no longer hold the cultural normal values that a lot of people hold. So they're seen as anathema, right? And we're going to tear them down. Some people are reinterpreting them, and that's their way to kind of deal with it. But then you have some people who will actually vandalize memorials as a way to kind of deal with their problematic status. So my favorite example is the statue to Juan de Oñate y Salazar, who was an early conquistador in New Mexico. And in the 90s, they built a memorial in honor of him. And it's an equestrian memorial. And he's grand, and he's, standing above everyone, and he's huge. And so part of the story of Juan de Oñate y Salazar was that supposedly, at least he, in addition to enslaving a lot of men, he prevented them from leaving by cutting off their toes, their big toes. And so after this memorial was built, a vandal came and cut off the toe and damaged the foot of the memorial itself.
Wow.
And they actually put an announcement into the media. I don't know how they got it through, but and they said, we are taking the bronze that we've vandalized, and we're melting it into little medallions that people can remember actually what happened and how terrible it was. So they kind of repurposed the statue rather than just destroying it, which they probably could have done. Also, that county had the highest heroin addiction rate in the country. So the dissonance between using public funds to create this memorial to honor someone who enslaved a lot of Native Americans was just too much, and so people revolted.
Wow. Yeah. What an amazing story. Wow. I know, and the title of your presentation at our Curiosity Fest was Memorials as Sites of Trauma and Healing. Can you talk a little bit more about those themes and how they're expressed in memorials?
Yes, that's a great question. Trauma is one of those words that is very popular in academia, and there's a lot of papers published on it, and people tend to kind of tap into that, but maybe sometimes it gets a little misused. So can I give you a couple academic definitions?
Okay,
Is that okay,
let's
Chris?
hear 'em, yeah.
Okay. So this is Kathy Carruth, who is one of the top trauma scholars. She says, trauma describes an overwhelming experience of sudden or catastrophic events in which the response to the event occurs in the often delayed, uncontrolled, repetitive appearance of hallucinations and other intrusive phenomena. And I think this is the way we're used to hearing about it, right? So something traumatic happens and you can't think about it. So it affects you in different ways, right? It comes back through nightmares or something like that. But then another trauma scholar named LaCapra says that working through trauma involves the effort to articulate or re-articulate affect and representation in a manner that may never transcend, but may to some viable extent counteract a reenactment or an acting out of that disabling association. So he's seen it more as a way you can work through trauma by representing what happened. And so people will often write their stories out or speak them out over and over again as they try to create a narrative which can help explain it. So I'm seeing memorials role kind of in our public or our cultural memory as being that representation, right? And now usually it's just a single representation, but it does go through a lot of drafting. So there's kind of this rearticulated way that we are thinking about the event, whatever it is. And that final representation that we have is kind of there for us. And it becomes this way that public memory retains its knowledge of the event, but also kind of gets through the trauma. And I never like to say heal in some kind of final sense, because I don't think that really happens. It's always a continuing process. So in that sense, we might say these memoirs are reifying our trauma, right? They're making our trauma into things, into material objects that we can then look at and have a little objectivity from.
I did want to ask you about the word reify. I'd seen you use it before. And can you define that again, what it means to reify?
Right. So it's just when you take something abstract and turn it into something physical.
Huh, okay.
Yeah. So it's a fun academic word.
A word I can use now.
Right. Kind of like deify, right? Deify.
Oh, okay. There you go. I wanted to talk a little bit more about war memorials, too. One of our Oklahoma Humanities magazine issues was focused on the First World War a few years ago. And there's a great article by a scholar named Jay Winter about memorials as sites of memory and mourning. And he mentioned the role and design of memorials kind of changed after the First World War because there were so many soldiers who died or disappeared without a trace. And memorials had to be created as a substitute for graves, like a public tomb and like a necessary place for mourning. And he also talks about how listing the names of the dead became really important, which is something that I think Maya Lin picked up on her Vietnam memorial as well. And there's an interesting part about how I guess a lot of First World War memorials are democratic in the sense that the generals' names, the captains' names, and the privates' names are all the names are just together. Right. Everyone's united in death, I suppose. But I really wanted to ask you about kind of the difficulty in balancing glorifying war in a war memorial versus commemorating what the experience really was. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on war memorials?
Yeah, I mean, World War I, which is mainly what that article's about, definitely brought a new scale to the way we think about death, right? And the way we have to deal with death, right? Like you were saying, and bury. And of course, World War II did that again as well. And so it kind of seems like there's been this progression that we've had to deal with as far as how do you represent this trauma? Do you represent all the names of these people, which is often done? There's a Holocaust memorial in Boston, which instead of using names, there's 6 glass towers, and numbers are used to represent all of the people who died. And so it's not, maybe they don't know all the names, right? Or they want to try to figure it out, or it's almost like we just want to represent the scale of it. And I think memorials struggle to do this, but they do attempt to represent that scale. One death is too much. So how do you represent, as the numbers get higher and higher, it just becomes more and more problematic. At the same time, I'm not sure how well we have an emotional distinction with numbers either. And I was wondering how that would relate to that article. So, if you say 1 million people died or 1.5 million people died, does it really affect you in a different way? And so once we get to kind of mass death, it becomes very difficult for us to kind of distinguish different ways to represent that. And it's just, we need a way to show how horrible it was. And sometimes I think you're right, that kind of granular, we're going to put every name and we're going to democratize it, like Maya Lin does. That's the most effective way to do it. Even while, almost everyone who visits that memorial is only going to go to one name, maybe 2, or not to any at all. And so the actual names have like this very minute resonance in terms of culture at large, but altogether we perceive their impact. Yeah.
Actually, I remember visiting the Vietnam Memorial as a kid, and I looked for people with my name. I looked for other people named Chris, and that kind of made it real to me. But it makes me think about, there's a quote from Joseph Stalin, of all people, about how a single death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths is a statistic.
Right. So, Right, yeah. And I mean, just the overwhelming nature, it can't be represented, right? And so how do we represent the unrepresentable is this kind of continuing question that memorials have to face.
I wanted to ask you about kind of the role of religion in memorials too. That came up in the article about First World War memorials, because the author points out that a lot of the symbolism or even the design of the memorials were taken from like pre-Christian cultures. There's like Egyptian obelisks, and,
right.
Greek. I'm not sure how to pronounce the word cenotaph.
Cenotaphs, okay. yeah.
So what are your thoughts on how religion can be used in memorials, or maybe how it shouldn't be used? I don't know.
No, I mean, people have very strong associations to this day with religion. I think sometimes we feel like maybe we live in a secular world, but we have inherited that tradition of symbols and of stories. So incorporating those can actually, be a very powerful way to represent what happened. Of course, we see that in the crosses and the use of other symbols. I noticed in the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. You may be familiar with that one from another Oklahoma Humanities article that was written. Maya Lin did this one as well. And so there's a wall, and then there's this table, and there's water running over the table, and it's a reflecting table. But on the wall is the quote, "Let justice roll down like a river," right? And it's credited to King, who's quoting the Bible, which I found almost hysterical, right?
Yeah.
Like what you credit it to King, and yet you've chosen one of the few lines where he is not giving original wording, and I think it just shows how singular that all is, right? King's words are the Bible words. The Bible's words are the words that we're reading right now, and they're all of a piece. And so there's kind of a collapsing of time that occurs in some memorials as they use religious imagery to matter to us. We don't feel that historical distance from those events.
Interesting. This is maybe a left field question, but are there any topics or historical incidents or people who you think should be memorialized but have not yet been for some reason?
I think it's your best question. I mean, all the questions are good, Chris, but this one I think is one that we need to think about because it's forward-looking. So we don't see many memorials to causes or to causes that have been successful in particular. So there's a Seneca Falls memorial to the women's movement, to the suffrage movement, and there are lots of civil rights memorials, but they tend to be focused around death and martyrdom. So there aren't many memorials that just kind of celebrate the good things that have happened in our culture, which I think is something we don't talk about very much. We always talk about the bad. So, for example, the homicide rate has dropped in the United States dramatically in the last couple of decades. And I think that's something we ought to have memorials to. I have no idea what they would look like or where they would go.
That's not your job.
No, that's not my job. I just get to prescribe, right?
That's fascinating.
So I would love to see more memorials to kind of these broader events that have occurred. Maybe slowly, maybe they weren't a single moment, right, that we can kind of put our finger on, but they have made our world a better place, and I think we ought to be celebrating that. By the way, a traditional distinction between the term memorial and monument is that memorials mourn a tragedy, and monuments celebrate a success.
Oh, okay.
So, and they typically don't get used correctly that way, and a lot of scholars, scoff at using that kind of distinction. But I kind of like to think about that when you're saying monument, you're looking kind of upward, and memorial, you're kind of looking downward.
Oh, okay. I'm so glad you mentioned that. Man, I should have asked that at the very beginning. Are there any interesting memorials or monuments that are being discussed right now or being debated that you're interested in?
Well, I was being positive earlier about Oklahoma's history with memorials, but you probably know about the Ten Commandments controversy, right?
At the state capitol.
At the state capitol. And so there is slated to be a new memorial at the state capitol, which is the Bill of Rights. And I find this fantastic. It seems like it's such a great text to use because almost all political groups seem to find a message to them in the Bill of Rights today, right? Now, we debate how it should be interpreted, right? But we don't really debate that the Bill of Rights is this foundational, essentially a sacred text for us. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with that one. Hopefully it'll be another Oklahoma success and not a Oklahoma eyesore.
That is so interesting. Is that the one thing that we can all agree on? Maybe the Bill of Rights.
I think maybe it is. Maybe if we don't fight too much about it, it'll be good.
We'll see who comes out and protests against the Bill of Rights memorial.
Right.
What are some other interesting memorials in Oklahoma that people might be interested in finding out more about, or some of your personal favorites too?
Take just a second.
Oh, sure. There's no such thing as dead air. Richard can remove any dead air.
It's fantastic. I just want to make sure I talk about. Where is that one? I'm sorry. Oh, so there are several Oklahoma memorials near Oklahoma City and in the suburbs that I think people ought to go to and know about. And I can just kind of list a few of these. to you. So there's this Girl Scout memorial in Mitch Park in Edmond, and it's a 400-pound sculpture of a Girl Scout planting a tree, and it got stolen, and they found it on the other side of Edmond in another park, and then it was returned to its current place. So it has one of these kind of histories, and no one quite knows why it was stolen. I mean, the Girl Scouts, who's against the Girl Scouts? I mean, it's Girl Scout season right now. We just bought a bunch of cookies, so
same here.
It seems about as least controversial as you could get, but it's really a good memorial. It's beautiful, and it's right along the trail. A few more serious ones. There's one called the May 3rd, 1999 Tornado Monument, and this is in Dell City, and it has this eagle bas-relief on the front, and it's a fantastic one.
Where in Dell City is it? Do you know?
I don't know.
We'll put a link to it on our website.
Dell City also has the largest women's veteran memorial, which I did not know until I started doing research. And by the way, waymarking.com is a fantastic site if you kind of like just jumping pages. People can go there and post memorials, and they've got basically an exhaustive list of landmarks and memorials in the United States. So the largest women's veteran monument, it's got these women, and they're holding hands, and they've got their backs to each other in defense, and it's fantastic. It's a great way to celebrate something that I think has been neglected by our cultural conscience. And then there's another cool memorial. This one's in Moore. And so in the Veterans Memorial Park there were some walnut trees and elm trees, and these 4 trees died in the winter of 2008 and 9. And so the city staff said that, hey, instead of cutting them down, can we do something useful with them, which I think is a great idea. And so they carved soldiers into these trees, and they've set up a war memorial. So rarely do you see a wooden war memorial. So that's something else that's pretty unique to Oklahoma.
I have some personal favorites. I was curious if you know about. Just because I've taken my daughter to this park many times, Stars and Stripes Park near Lake Hefner. On the south side of Lake Hefner. There's a really interesting, I guess, so it's a memorial to. I'm trying to think if it's a monument or a memorial. It's a memorial to Dwight Eisenhower. It's this pavilion that's out that kind of sticks out into the lake. And it's sort of in disrepair, which is a shame. There's a bust of Eisenhower that when my daughter was really little, she would go up and touch this giant Eisenhower head. And there are quotes, fascinating quotes by Dwight Eisenhower all around this weird pavilion. The design of it is really unique and interesting, and it's in such a prominent location, but I think hardly anybody really notices it anymore because some of the plaques have fallen off, some of the quotes are gone. It's really a shame. And I'm so curious. I think it was erected around the time of his death, maybe in the late 60s or early 70s. So somebody around here had the idea to memorialize Dwight Eisenhower there. It's fascinating. And then another one is the USS Oklahoma Anchor, which is near downtown Oklahoma City. It's one of I read about it a little bit. It's one of 3 anchors that was on the ship that was sunk on at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. It's just amazing to see. That's the actual anchor that was on the ship. It's kind of an amazing thing to drive by. It's on Broadway,
and that's a neat idea to use something about the original itself, in the memorial. So often we'll see them also as burial sites, and they become shrines, right? And so it kind of serves that dual purpose of being the tomb as well as the place of remembrance, which doesn't have to be the case. There's this interesting conversation about actual material objects that we bring to the memorial or that exist at the memorial and how those change, right? So people bringing teddy bears to memorials or, all kinds of crazy things that people take to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Those are actually archived by the National Archive, and they keep all of those, or at least they were for a while. I think it just got too overwhelming. They may have stopped. And there's some debate about, is this right? At what point does kind of, if you sell teddy bears to people at a memorial site, is there kind of an irreverence there, right? And so with the Timothy McVeigh execution, they actually sold like Timothy McVeigh T-shirts to that, right? And of course that wasn't, and so that's for some people very problematic to kind of have these kitsch items be part of the way we remember it, because it feels like you're really doing a disservice to the actual event.
We see that in Oklahoma City at the bombing memorial.
Exactly, right. So,
sorry, go ahead.
No. I mean, so there's kind of 2 ways to look at it, right? On the one hand, you want to say, well, these memorials should serve a higher purpose, right? They should, like the USS Arizona in Hawaii, right? It's a memorial to the people who died in the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but it's also kind of a justification for using the atomic bomb.
Oh.
So there are places where the memorials take on this kind of political significance as well. And some people feel that if you are, devaluing them by making these kind of base sentiments present at the memorial, then that's a huge problem. On the other hand, if someone has a teddy bear and they place it on a gravestone or memorial, who am I to say that is wrong?
Right.
And that is not a legitimate emotion. So I think there's a tension there, and we kind of have to accept that. I don't think there's a good resolution to it.
When you described the statue in New Mexico with the toes that had been cut off of it, it made me think about another. I guess this would be a monument, the Pioneer Woman statue in Ponca City.
Yeah.
I saw an exhibit at the Oklahoma History Center about the movement to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, and there was an amazing photograph of a demonstration at the Pioneer Woman Museum where they wrapped the Pioneer Woman statue in chains to represent.
Oh, wow.
This was in the 1970s to represent how women are still being held back. It was such an iconic statue to begin with, and then to see it altered in that way was really powerful.
That's really cool. I love it when people interact with memorials.
Yeah.
We feel like, oh, they're off limits, right? But no, I think that encourages us to think about them and to revise our history, right? Or to remember our history.
Yeah.
So, that's fantastic. Yeah.
To make them interactive somehow.
Right,
It's
interactive.
really powerful.
So there is a movement called counter monuments that have sought to do this. And there's some Holocaust memorials which are counter monuments. But I can tell you about my favorite one. I hate to preempt one of your questions here, but it was a cylinder, and that went pretty high off the ground, and it was made of lead. And they put styluses like attached to the ground, like basically pins nearby. And so people would come by and they would take the stylus and they'd write their name on it, or they'd write someone that they remember. And because it was made of this lead, or maybe it was a lead alloy, it slowly degraded over time.
Oh.
And this was intentional, so that as people put their mark in it, and they actually changed it, and eventually it went all the way to the ground, and it's just essentially a paver there that has some writing on it. So that memorial encouraged graffiti, encouraged interaction, and by doing so, it kind of brought about its own end. But most of these memorials don't survive forever anyway. So why not make that part of the way memory can filter out and kind of come to some kind of resting point?
Man, that's amazing. I'm sure it's a more powerful experience to interact with a memorial than to just sort of passively take it in or stare at it.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some others where you walk along and you trip a laser and it projects images, on the ground around you or something like that, so that it's always changing based on the time of day and season, etc. And so you're always kind of getting a different view of the memorial.
Oh, fascinating. Huh. So what have I not asked you about memorials that I should have? What else should we know about memorials and monuments?
That is a great question, Chris.
Always my best question.
I know. I am really interested in the way we kind of have come to view certain sites as tourists. And so this would be the case more with maybe Holocaust memorials, people going to Auschwitz, right, to remember, but also there's an edge of tourism with that. And there's actually this really good book called Dark Tourism by John Lennon and Malcolm Foley. Maybe we can put that on the website as well. And they see this fundamental shift in the way in which death, disaster, and atrocity are handled by those who are offered tourism products. And so, we go to some of these memorials and maybe we're not remembering so much as kind of trying to take on this prosthetic memory, this memory that's not our own, right? And that can be okay, but sometimes it's a way to authenticate our own lives when we feel like our own lives are kind of, emptied out. Or at least this is the critique, right? That we live these inauthentic lives. And so we go to other places to experience authenticity. And there is something to that, right? But we also live in a world that is so globalized that we do feel in touch with other places, right? So I have not yet been to the 9/11 memorial, but I want to go there because it was central to our cultural memory, it's central to the way I grew up. And so I think we do need these places, but we also need to go to them with a mindset that is not just the consumerism that we live in all the time. That was probably a bit of a downer.
No.
Also, we talked about the Oklahoma bombing memorial a little bit. I don't know if most people know that there's another memorial adjacent to it, next to the church that was destroyed there, and it's of Jesus, right? And it's called. It says, "And Jesus wept" on it.
And he's facing away from.
He's facing away, and his face is down, and his hand is covering his face. And I love that one too because, obviously a religious figure, Jesus is very, going to be controversial in different people who view the memorial, but it's not a controversial verse or a sentiment. It's just this idea of weeping, and I love that. It's just this is grief, right? We're not moralizing. We're not telling this, Christian evangelical message about salvation. Instead, we're just allowing the pain to be there. And so I think it's really another one of those moments of success in terms of not going too far with particular standpoints in the memorial design. And there's, if you just Google it, you can get some images of both memorials together. And it's the contrast there is just striking.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely put some images. This is going to be a great webpage about this episode.
They're very visual. That's why I like them. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming on and talking about
this was Nathan. Fantastic experience. Thank you, Chris.
Really appreciate it. Is there anything you'd like to mention about your work or your university?
Well, at Oklahoma Christian, we've had this great series called History Speaks, and we've had a lot of key figures from the civil rights era actually come and speak. Just this past week, we had one of the members of the Central Park Five come and speak at OC. So there's really an effort to tap into civil rights and to be aware of the culture that we share part in. We had Brian Stevenson come last year. He's the director and the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative that started that built the Memorial for Peace and Justice that we talked about earlier. And there was just a movie that came out about his memoirs called Just Mercy. So OC is a place where we're trying to talk about these ideas seriously. And so, hey, I appreciate you letting me mention that.
Yeah, and this is an ongoing series. Is there a website that people can check to see who's coming?
Yes, maybe we can post that.
Yeah, we'll do that for sure. It makes me think about, also speaking of monuments, I know there's kind of an ongoing discussion in Oklahoma City about somehow coming up with a monument to Clara Luper, because a very visible one does not exist on the site of the protest that she led. And I think that was
great. Yeah,
I think it was prompted by the book Boomtown, about the history of Oklahoma City, and the author of that book and the mayor are both have an ongoing project to try to figure out a way to memorialize Clara Luper there.
Yeah, and I would just encourage people listening to try to be involved in these discussions. Give your voice, because if people don't speak up, their voices are not going to be heard, and just whoever is there will get to decide. So I think that's a great way to engage democratically. Sometimes we're kind of cynical about our democracy, but this is a positive, effective way that we can be part of it.
And it's being part of something that lives on for generations after you're gone, even. Right. Well, thank you again. What a great discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. I enjoyed it.
And so listeners can check out our website at okhumanities.org/brainbox for additional information about the topics we discussed in this episode. And we encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the Brainbox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/brainbox website, and on social media by using #BrainboxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Jeff Moreva, and this program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. This has been Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin.